the speed of the forerunner country in order to catch up at some point and reach a similar stage of technological advancement. This process is exactly where leapfrogging is suggesting a different approach, either by skipping stages, so moving from technology A to technology C right away, or technology D, or moving from technology B to technology D, but essentially skipping one stage that other countries passed through previously. The other possibility of leapfrogging would be to create a new path, so maybe move along with technology A and B, but then adopt technology C or self-developed technology C dash. That's a little differently. It's still serving the same purpose, but it takes a little bit of a different approach. Same with technology D. A good example of the stage skipping catch-up would be mobile phones, for instance. So historically, most high-income countries nowadays at some point adopted landlines, rolled out landline connections all throughout their countries. And what you can see now with countries such as Kenya, Tanzania, or other lower income countries, what you can see is that they don't adopt the landline technology anymore, but they move right to mobile technology, which of course high income countries are also doing. So in this example, technology B would be the landline technology that was just skipped, moving right to mobile technology, the technology C. One example that you're probably all familiar with for path creating catch-up would be M-Pesa. So when M-Pesa was implemented in Kenya, most high-income countries had their financial system organized around formal banks with branches and ATMs. And at this point, Kenya didn't have that system as rolled out as much as other high-income countries. And instead of rolling that out first and then, for instance, turning to M-Pesa, they used M-Pesa as a technology trying to serve a similar purpose, but using a different technology, slightly different technology. That would be a good example of path creating catch-up. Essentially, with both of those ways of leapfrogging, the idea is that the catching up country would bypass one stage of technological development and move to a different one, a more superior one. The benefit in theory of this process would be that by bypassing the technology, that country is also able to bypass all the investments necessary in human capital, physical capital, of course, too, that would go towards a technology that's already or soon is going to be obsolete anyways. So instead of using those investments for this technology, the countries are able to go to a better, superior, a more modern technology right away, and using the investments thus a lot more efficiently, and then creating a higher productivity. That's the hope of leapfrogging. With the two examples that I've given you, mobile phones and M-Pesa, you might already see a little bit of a difference between those two instances. This is actually what researchers point towards very, very frequently when it comes to leapfrogging, that there's a difference on the one side between leapfrogging in consumption and leapfrogging in production. So leapfrogging in consumption would be exactly that very rapid spread of mobile phone technology around lower income countries. It's a little hard, of course, to classify it very, very strictly like that, because of course mobile phones can also be used in businesses, so they would be somewhat connected to production or to not mere consumption. But as a general example, you could think of mobile phones more of as a consumption good for the overall population, and that of course is able to drastically improve welfare, enabling people now to make phone calls wherever they are. But what many researchers point towards is that it does not necessarily enhance the technological capabilities of, let's say, the manufacturing sector, for instance, if those mobile phones are always imported and produced abroad. So what they point towards this leapfrogging in production then as a solution or as an option that is supposed to raise economic development and technological capabilities within a country. So in this case, in technology leapfrogging in production, you could think of two ways how leapfrogging could be used in production. One, using the technology as an input factor for production. So, for instance, organizing your plant using very, very modern machines, but and then you don't really need to look at the good that's produced in the end. The second option would be producing the technology that the country or the industry leapfrog to, or parts of that technology. In this case, the capabilities would actually be used, the technological capabilities to produce very, very modern technology, or maybe even, of course, just parts of that, so integrating into the global value chain. If we turn again to the example of M-Pesa, and that's going to come up one more time later, it's a really good example to illustrate the different perspectives you can also take on one good or one service and see where leapfrogging took place and in which way. So for instance, with M-Pesa, on one side, the leapfrogging took place in consumption as many people adopted mobile phones to begin with. So the rapid diffusion of mobile technology in the overall population that consumed the mobile phones was the basis for the development of M-Pesa. So in this way, M-Pesa, or the basis of it, could be viewed as leapfrogging in consumption. At the same time, of course, there was also leapfrogging in production, actually in both ways that I just outlined. So one perspective would draw the attention to the fact that the mobile technology was also an input factor for the production of M-Pesa because it was based on a mobile platform. At the same time, though, M-Pesa can also be viewed just independently as the financial service that it is. So a product developed independently, and thus also the leapfrogging in the production in the sense of actually producing an up-to-date technology. With those different views on the question of whether it's leapfrogging consumption or production, you can also see that there's a difference whether you would assign stage skipping leapfrogging or path creating leapfrogging to it. With the consumption, mobile phones, I've said it briefly before, is a perfect example of leapfrogging in consumption as a stage skipping process. So the landlines were skipped. In production, when you look at M-Pesa as a service, then you can see the aspect of path creating leapfrogging, since it fulfilled the function of, or at least partly, the functions of a mobile banking system, but used a new technology for it. So that would be path creating in this way. And that's why M-Pesa is often regarded as a success story of leapfrogging, because it wasn't just the leapfrogging in consumption that took place, but it was using that leapfrogging in mobile technology in order to produce a new service, to create something domestically, and thus enhance economic development. If we look at those examples, one of mobile phones, but of course also M-Pesa, then one might think that it's very, very easy to just leapfrog to whichever technology you would prefer or that would be most beneficial for a country or an industry. But if it was that easy, if leapfrogging was that easy, and if you could transfer technologies with the same productivity from one part of the world to another, then you would expect every production essentially to move to countries with a lower income right now, because other input factors such as labor would be cheaper, and thus it would lower the costs of the overall production. But since this dynamic is not visible, there must be some kind of catch to it. So there must be something that's necessary for leapfrogging to take place. And there's actually very many regression analysis, very many studies trying to establish which factors overall, looking at the economy broadly, are necessary or are fostering leapfrogging. And those factors I put here kind of as the backdrop for leapfrogging. So that's human capital, for instance. So knowledge, health, education. infrastructure, financial sector development, labor force participation, domestic investments, institutional quality. All of those factors are the backdrop against which leapfrogging can take place, and all of those factors are making it more probable for leapfrogging to take place and to be successful. There's also other studies that go into a little bit of more detail now that point towards the absorptive capacity that's important domestically for leapfrogging to take place. Just very, very generally, leapfrogging technologies are usually characterized by the fact that it does not take a lot of knowledge of the previous technology in order to adopt the new one. So for instance, you don't need to know landline development in every last detail in order to roll out a mobile phone system in a country. But of course, it still takes some capacity to absorb that knowledge about the new technology. So absorptive capacity refers to internal knowledge within firms or industries or countries, depending on the level that you're looking at. It refers to complementary technological capacities and to skills just in general. So if you think about mobile phones, for instance, on the side of consumers, you would need a very basic level of literacy often in order for them to be able to use the mobile phones. You would then, in terms of infrastructure, technological capabilities, you would need a power grid at least, so that you're able to power the mobile system, and you would need skilled workers that are able to roll out the phone system and manage that. So that would be absorptive capacity. Then one last point when we're looking at the overall general framework in which leapfrogging can take place is regulation. And for that aspect, M-Pesa is the perfect example again, because leading up to M-Pesa's development, first of all, there was a liberalization of the mobile phone market in Kenya, so lowering taxes, increasing competition, so that phones in the first place were even able to diffuse rapidly in Kenya. Then, during the time of the development of M-Pesa, there was actually no regulation in place yet for e-money. And instead of imposing that regulation beforehand, the authorities and especially the Central Bank of Kenya worked very closely together with Safaricom in order to find the most suitable regulation while they were developing and rolling out M-Pesa. So this is usually regarded as allowing regulation to follow innovation, and that's a point that's not just being pointed out in the case of M-Pesa, but also in other cases, and just more generally is one of the factors that researchers point towards as important for leapfrogging. So essentially, that regulation is supposed to give some flexibility to experiment and to have innovation take place. All of these factors are kind of like the broad framework that you can understand leapfrogging in the context of. There's fortunately also studies that dive very much into detail, looking at specific industries, especially in South Korea, where leapfrogging in manufacturing took place successfully and also unsuccessfully. And based on these examples of these, based on these studies, they were able to establish a little more detailed model of how leapfrogging can take place and which factors contribute to the success or failure of leapfrogging. Before going back to that overall view of leapfrogging, I'm just going to take a quick detour to their view of leapfrogging in those studies, and they refer to leapfrogging usually as a process, or they think of leapfrogging as a part of the process of reverse engineering. So in this process of reverse engineering, you usually have a sequence of, in the first stage, just manufacturing with foreign product designs and plant designs. So basically just assembling products. In the second stage, then manufacturing products still based on foreign design, product design, but with domestic plant design. In the third stage, then designing modified versions of existing products, so imitative products. And in the fourth stage, developing new products totally independently and products that hadn't been there before. And in all of those stages, different learning takes place. On the first stage, for instance, firms are able to learn or to gain operational skills. In the second stage, then learning about how to develop a process design, so how to establish a plant. In the third stage, designing a product without necessarily developing it, the whole concept of the product independently. And then in the last stage, of course, the product development is the learning goal. These stages or this process of reverse engineering for the authors is very important in order to secure a long-term market share. They point towards examples in South Korea, especially the consumer electronics for the audio and video, consumer electronics and computer assembly, where the industries were able to move parts of that process. They were able to reach stage 2, maybe sometimes even stage 3. But since they always still had that gap in technological capabilities that didn't allow them to develop products independently, they at some point lost their market shares again when they were not competitive anymore. So in the beginning, an advantage of South Korea were low labor costs, for instance. So the input factors were cheap and the products were able to compete based on that cost edge. And as the cost for those input factors rose, though, there were other competitors such as Chinese firms that were able to produce at a lower cost and thus were able to drive those South Korean manufacturers out of the market partially. So this is why they say in order to have a sustainable market share, it's important to reach one of those later stages where the firms have a lot of technological capabilities and are able to work on the forefront of an industry. The whole process, what they outline, especially in the first two stages, of course, depends on foreign knowledge. So external knowledge guiding that production process. And they say that there's usually for most firms and most industries, a challenge arises between stage 2 and 3, and that is that foreign firms grow reluctant to sell their product designs since the company they would be selling it to might soon be a competitor. So they lose that access to external knowledge. So it's not necessarily their own decision to move to the stage 3, but at some point it's just inevitable since they don't have the access to external knowledge anymore. And to bridge that gap and to start designing and developing products independently, they point towards research and development investments as an important factor to build that technological capability. So you will hear me, and you would also find in the papers that those terms, leapfrogging, technological capability, and research and development are used almost as synonyms, because in the end, what their argument is that that research and development investments enhance technological capabilities that allow firms to move then to the later stages in this process, and then to leapfrog in production, producing products of the most recent technology, and to be innovators within their industries in the end. Of course, though, what I've outlined now, the importance of the later stages for leapfrogging is mainly that you're able to actually produce the up-to-date technologies. Leapfrogging can take place in the first stages too, of course, though, as input factors. So having a very modern plant design, for instance. So coming from this little excursus about the process of reverse engineering, to put it more systematically, Lee and Lim, the authors of those studies, point to two factors that they find to be very, very important when it comes to the probability of leapfrogging to take place, of investments in research and development, and for building up technological capabilities. And these factors are, on the one side, the available resources. So this is, on the one side, financial resources. So is an industry able to make the necessary investments in research and development? And then knowledge, that can refer to internal knowledge and external knowledge. But they stress, since they observed in all the industries that they studied, that external knowledge was very important. They stress that access to foreign knowledge is an important resource for leapfrogging to take place in the first place. On the other side, they point to the level of technological effort as a determining factor of leapfrogging, or the success of leapfrogging. And this level of technological effort is determined, again, on the one side, by the probability of successful product development. So for a firm or industry, how likely is it that their product will be, or that the development process for a product will be successful in the end? And on the other side, is that product going to be competitive globally? So does it have a cost edge? Is there sufficient product differentiation? Do they have a first mover advantage? These kind of factors go into that second part, the product competitiveness. And this is now where the main argument comes in. The probability of successful product development, again, depends on the technological regime within an industry. And they name three elements that they find most important, or the most important characteristics of a technological regime. And that is for once the cumulativeness of technical advances. What that basically means is the frequency of innovation within an industry. So if innovation is very, very frequent, that offers, of course, on the upside, very many entry points for leapfrogging to take place. So quite a lot of different technologies or stages that a country can leapfrog to. And also through that dynamic, a lot more niches that new upcoming firms could find their place in. But on the downside, if the innovation takes place very frequently, that also means that the investments necessary to leapfrog would have to be provided in a shorter amount of time, since you only from one innovation to the next one, you don't have a lot of time. So if you want to leapfrog successfully, you have to get those resources in a very brief period of time. And then in the end, once you leapfrog, you also have to put in a lot of effort to stay up to date with those frequent innovations. So their argument in the end is that frequency makes it less likely for firms, or firms have a lower incentive to invest in this sector, in those technologies to leapfrog to. The second element is the fluidity of the technological trajectory. So the question basically, how predictable is the next innovation going to be? If it's less predictable, of course, the success of a product is also less certain, thus again lowering the incentive for investment. And the last part is the properties of the knowledge base within the industry, basically referring to the question of whether or not knowledge is accessible in general within the industry. This is the model that they use to estimate, or also to explain, looking back on the South Korean development, why certain leapfrogging efforts were successful and others weren't, and how that is connected to the varying factors that I've listed here. They also point to specific examples, though, outlining, using those examples, how governments can support the process of leapfrogging and what their role might be, depending on the different structures of an industry and the different technological regimes. So one example that they use is Hyundai. Hyundai, when developing their first engine independently, were making, or had to make, a decision between sticking to the standard engine at the time, the carburetor-based engine, or developing an engine with a new upcoming technology, the electronic injection-based engine. The trajectory at that time was pretty clear that all engines at some point would move to that new design. So the technological regime in that way was very favorable in terms of the fluidity of technological trajectory. Major conceptual changes in the automotive industry are also not very, very frequent. So the cumulativeness of technical advances also didn't prohibit any investments in that new technology. And the knowledge base, and also the available knowledge that was a little more tricky, because actually that's one of the cases where the forerunner firms were reluctant to sell their designs or their research about the new engine type to the soon-to-be competitor Hyundai. But Hyundai found a specialized research and development firm in the UK that worked on those designs, and since it was their business model, was very happy to sell that knowledge to Hyundai. So in all of these areas, basically, so we have a high probability of successful product development. We have the available knowledge. The government didn't have to do anything, because for Hyundai, that decision was pretty clear that the investment should take place, and the finances were also available for a big company like that. The only thing that was where government in the end intervened was the point of product competitiveness. And that's because the car industry is characterized by a big importance of tacit knowledge. So learning by doing plays a big role in terms of lowering the costs in the end after having manufactured for some time and knowing the process better. So when that competitiveness through learning by doing was not fully given yet, the South Korean government established temporary domestic market protection just to give Hyundai a market that it was able to produce for competitively, and in that process learn or get that tacit knowledge to foster the learning by doing. The other example where the characteristics of the industry were slightly different, and especially the technological regime was vastly different, was the CDMA development. CDMA is a mobile transmission technology, and when South Korea was considering rolling out a mobile phone system all around the country, the question was whether to stick with a standard system, especially in Europe, the GSM system, or to develop the CDMA system for the first time, actually, in a big national rollout. So in theory, it was clear that at the time back then, CDMA technology was supposed to be a little superior to GSM technology, but it had never been employed on that scale as a national system. So the competitiveness would have been awesome if the development of the product would have been successful, because there wouldn't have been many competitors, and the firms developing CDMA would have had a great first mover advantage. And the South Korean government also preferred this option of developing CDMA technology simply because of that idea of building technological capacities in the process. So when you're developing CDMA, learning how to develop technology, brand new technology. The problem, as I've already hinted, is the technological regime, which is quite unfavorable in the mobile transmission technology sector. First of all, technological trajectory is also very fluid, so you wouldn't be certain if CDMA was actually the next step in the technological development within the industry. At least the knowledge was partly given, because there was a US firm that was working on CDMA. They hadn't had a full design for a national system, but at least they had a starting point, stepping block of that knowledge. And in the end, all of those factors contributed to low probability of successful product development for any individual firm. What the government did then were multiple interventions. First of all, the South Korean government was very well informed about the technological trajectory within the industry and about the technology itself. It had government research facilities and was thus able to supply information to all actors within the market. Second of all, they made CDMA the national standard in South Korea, thus also creating an initial market and lowering the risk of investments. Because even if in the end it would turn out that CDMA was inferior to GSM, or was not the next big step in technology, at least there would be some market and some revenue could be generated from that market. And the South Korean government built an R&D consortium between government institutions, between the different actors within the market, and thus sharing the risk and also the resources. So essentially also taking care of finances in this way. Nowadays, South Korean firms within that sector, the mobile transmission technology, are among the forerunners when it comes to innovation. And by some papers looking back on this development, some point to this development of CDMA as a turning point for the technology innovation in South Korea. But the authors, Lee and Lim, they also caution that if it wasn't for the very, very, very well-informed government, all of those interventions would have not been very feasible, because in the end, it does take a lot of knowledge on the side of the government about the industry, about the technology itself, to make those interventions. So they say that even though it was very successful in this place, it might not be feasible for any government and also not in any situation. So these two examples have shown some avenues of how governments are able to support leapfrogging. Without presenting the full examples now, just want to point out some more ways that it is possible. First of all, when knowledge resources are unavailable, governments are able to link, for instance, public research and private sectors, so universities and businesses, or also trying to facilitate reverse brain drain, so trying to get researchers from abroad into the country and help on the development of those projects. When financial resources are unavailable generally, or also if due to the high frequency of innovation, those resources need to be available within a very short amount of time, a very short period of time, then the governments are able to start joint research or just give financial support. But again, knowing whether or not that is necessary also depends on the domestic industry structure again. For instance, the semiconductor industry in South Korea or just in general, semiconductors have a very high frequency of innovation, and the industry in South Korea was characterized by many big industrial conglomerates that were able to raise that money for the investments, while firms in Taiwan were more often small and medium-sized enterprises and therefore depended on government support to make those investments. The product competitiveness is a difficult point, because in the end, determining whether or not the product is going to be competitive is very hard. If it already is, no support is needed. If it will never be, then there shouldn't be any support, because the industry would always rely on government support in order to be competitive. So it always takes that potential comparative advantage over global competitors. But in instances like Hyundai, where you need that learning by doing knowledge, that tacit knowledge, you can have government interventions that aim at market creation, so that there's a market, start production and start learning. And that doesn't necessarily need to be domestic market protection, but could also be export subsidies or public procurement, or that national standardization, like in the instance of CDMA technology. Looking at other papers, apart from the one of Lee and Lim, Some also give different recommendations. Just in general, I think we've seen from the model that it takes very, very careful analysis of all of the details of the environment of industries nationally and internationally. And the requirement for any support is always identifying industries that could potentially have a comparative advantage and be competitive at some point globally. And making that analysis ex ante might prove very, very difficult. And therefore, some recommend sticking to soft instead of hard industrial policy. So not putting in any measures that alter prices, such as domestic market protection, also because it creates a big incentive for companies to just lobby in their own individual interests, but instead use soft industrial policy. So that would be ensuring the access to knowledge and human capital, providing infrastructure, eliminating coordination failure, harnessing the benefits of positive externalities and knowledge spillovers, but nothing that would alter the prices in the market. So these are the two sides of the argument, the one pointing at instances where it has worked in South Korea with hard industrial policy, others cautioning that just the amount of knowledge is so vast that sticking to softer industrial policy might be more suitable for most of the situations. So to turn to the question again that I posed in the beginning, does leapfrogging pose a promising development shortcut? I think from the examples of South Korean industries of M-Pesa, it becomes clear that there's a very big potential for leapfrogging to transform parts of the economy. And the theory also shows those benefits with the investments that can go to upcoming technologies instead of obsolete technologies, and thus using those resources a lot more efficiently. But if we look at this picture again, and I think this is the perfect illustration of that, it also becomes clear that leapfrogging is amazingly complex. It's not a very easy development shortcut that you can just take without looking at anything else, without looking at any of those requirements or characteristics. I've outlined all of the factors that leapfrogging depends on: the human capital, infrastructure, public goods, domestic investments, the absorptive capacity, regulation, and then in the end, all of those characteristics of markets, of technologies, of firms. So trying to support leapfrogging or using leapfrogging for economic development requires an extremely well-informed government, a very, very thorough analysis, and in the end also cooperation with the private sector, because the complexity is just too great for just the government to have an overview of it all. And reflecting on that and all of those factors, it becomes clear that leapfrogging is actually quite closely related to just general industrial policy or development policies. So viewing and perceiving leapfrogging as a complement of those overall development strategies seems much more suitable than proposing it as an alternative, as a substitute for having that overall development or industrial policy. Thank you very much.
So, Oscar, what advice would you give, say, your African government of choice or Kenya about what sectors you think are ripe for maybe leapfrogging, or at the very least some further examination of the possibility?
Thanks a lot for the question, Emmanuel. I've had the chance to give this presentation to some of my colleagues at the office on Friday already, and there was also one question that came up in the end there. I thought about this over the weekend to see whether or not I could identify parts or industries in Kenya, for instance, that might hold potential for leapfrogging. But unfortunately, I couldn't come up with many sectors that hold that potential. Just I think because I don't have enough knowledge about the Kenyan industries, and I think in the end, if it would have been a miracle if I could have come up with that over the weekend, because my main takeaway from the research on leapfrogging was how complex it is, how much goes into leapfrogging, and how much knowledge about very, very specific characteristics of industries, of markets need to go into finding, identifying, and in the end then supporting those leapfrogging activities that hold potential for long-term comparative advantage and development. Therefore, I think the complexity in general makes it very hard, together with my lack of very specific knowledge about Kenyan industries, for me to give a specific recommendation for an industry. But just in general, if I pull up the last slide again of the presentation, there are some factors, of course, the ones that I pointed towards in the first place, this backdrop against which leapfrogging takes place, that are very closely related with overall general industrial policy and development policy, and that I would therefore in any case find a very good support for leapfrogging activities. So investing in infrastructure and human capital and education, improving institutional quality and financial sector development, labor force participation, domestic investments. All of those things are not just crucial for leapfrogging, and therefore, but also support leapfrogging in the end. So I think those are always viable avenues for supporting leapfrogging in general. And due to the complexity, many researchers point to the necessity of facilitating a dialogue between private and public sector, because it's just too complex for any one entity to solve it alone. So some point, for instance, to the possibility of supporting the setup, or just in general the representation of businesses through associations. So giving them, trying to use those associations in the end to gain the knowledge about those specifics that are in the end important to determine what can support leapfrogging, and also which industries or specific branches of industries might hold potential for leapfrogging. I hope I was able to answer your question well through that.
Oscar, I have a question. When you talked about absorptive capacity, so the chart that you have in front of us is basically saying that all these things contribute to absorptive capacity, and then capacity finally, so they all funnel into absorptive capacity, which then tells us how ripe a country is for leapfrogging. Did I get that correct?
I think my the graph or the illustration I was putting together there might be a little misleading in that sense, because it's not necessarily that all those background factors or all of this contributes to absorptive capacity. I was more trying to show that with that gray sphere you see in the background, that this is just like a general domestic environment, that you could identify the state of infrastructure for the human capital. And absorptive capacity, of course, is a little closer to the leapfrogging process itself, since it might require some specific knowledge for a specific leapfrogging activity. So in that chart, and also those other factors, the available resources and the level of technological effort, I didn't mean to put them as a determining factor for absorptive capacity. So that's I would firstly view those separately, all of them. But of course, you cannot completely separate the absorptive capacity from those general underlying factors and that backdrop. So, for instance, absorptive capacity, I talked about complementary technological capabilities, or technological systems, like my example that I used of the power grid or the energy system for mobile phones. Of course, that's part of the infrastructure too. So it's quite closely related there. the other parts of absorptive capacity, the skill sets, for instance, are to some extent also related to human capital, of course. I think the difference that I was trying to make there was only that the absorptive capacity is much more specific for the leapfrogging technology then, but of course is still related to those facilitating factors, the overall facilitating factors.
I have another question, Oscar. What do you think? How do you think a country, from the perspective of national policy, should prioritize its efforts to move towards creating the conditions conducive to leapfrogging? And what would you also say about what the private sector can prioritize in the same direction?
Oh, I think that's the toughest question so far. In terms of national policy, I think it really depends on the specific country and the circumstances in those countries. Especially those activities that address very specific industries, also on the government side, even though they might have a big benefit in the end, a great benefit. The CDMA development that some consider the turning point in the technological capabilities, they still require a lot of effort for the government to put in. So depending on the overall state within the country, and also the priorities that emerge from the national discourse, especially engaging in those efforts that address specific industries might not be #1 priority always. Of course, in some instances, leapfrogging can also help solve other problems. So, for instance, I've read a couple of times about healthcare provision via mobile phones, for instance. At the same time, even though there's a benefit of that, usually in those pieces that I've read on that, researchers and commentators always caution that the possibility of leapfrogging should never lead to short-term solutionism. So just trying to address one very specific problem with one technology that you might have, but neglecting then the overall an overall deficit or an overall room for improvement, for instance, in healthcare services. So I think it's very, very hard for me to answer that question more specifically. Apart from it depends on the countries, it depends on the circumstances and priorities that exist outside from that. And to the second part of your question, the private sector, I think that's a good question to ask someone with a business background. I don't have that business background, unfortunately. But of course, that model that I'm presenting here might be a very, very, very rough guideline also for companies to look at when determining whether or not leapfrogging would work for them. But I don't have the business background, but I would assume that they would probably find different terms for that, and maybe just look on the probability of successful product development through different study methods. So looking at the markets, doing surveys, maybe product competitiveness. They are probably able to judge that very, very well. And of course, the absorptive capacity too. So if I look at knowledge that's available, do I think that I'm able to incorporate that into my production process right now or not? And yeah, lastly, of course, also the availability of the knowledge. So seeing whether or not other companies are able to sell knowledge to me, and to have me license their product design, for instance. I think, and I think that the general takeaway from the general process of reverse engineering it could be even for private companies that at some point they might run into that difficulty of obtaining licenses and external knowledge. So maybe also keep in mind that at some point the investments in research and development for building up technological capabilities are going to be very important to stay on that path of reverse engineering and actually in the end reach a point where they're not competing in terms of prices only, but also in terms of their designs and yeah, their differentiation from other products. But as I said, in no means I want to create the impression here that I would know a lot about business or companies, but that's just from the overall framework things that I could deduct from that.
Since it seems there aren't any more questions, perhaps I'll invite Oscar to give us any last comments and give us his parting shot on the question of leapfrogging.
Yeah, thanks a lot, first of all, for everyone attending and participating. It's been great to present the findings of my research that I've been able to carry out the last few months and weeks. In addition to the other work that I've been doing at the IEA as an intern. Leapfrogging has always been something that came up to me even in undergraduate studies in specific courses, especially when it came to mobile phone technology. And judging by those examples, it always seemed to me that there's great potential for leapfrogging. So this part of the research didn't quite surprise me to see that there's even bigger examples, so to say, with the CDMA development or other South Korean industries where leapfrogging has been a very, very good strategy for the overall domestic development. But what I've found very interesting about the research that I've done now was coming up with that illustration in the end and putting together all the factors that I could identify based on the literature that go into making leapfrogging successful and harnessing the potential that there is. I don't think that many commentators only point towards leapfrogging as the silver bullet when it comes to economic development. Many also include some of those factors that I've outlined here, but putting that all together and seeing that leapfrogging is a process very closely related to overall development policy and a process that requires a lot of knowledge and cooperation between different actors was very interesting, and I hope I was able to get that point across to you too in that webinar. Thank you very much for attending.